Welcome to A Canadian Investing in the U.S., a podcast and YouTube channel focused on Canadians buying real estate with host Glen Sutherland.
Hello and welcome to another episode of A Canadian Investing in the U.S. I am your host, Glen Sutherland. In case you don't know who I am the host of this show, A Canadian Investing in the U.S. I'm also the host or co-host of Advanced Real Estate Investing Talk. Both great podcasts, in my opinion. A little biased, but anyway. So, where do I live? Do I live in Canada? Do I live in the U.S.? I actually live in Canada. I live just outside of Waterloo, Ontario. I own properties in both Canada and the U.S. I actually, to give you the summary, I have sold off my Canadian properties. As everyone who's Canadian listening to this knows that we've appreciated a ton, and I've cashed out on those properties. So where do I invest now? Alabama, Indiana, Missouri, Ohio, and Florida. So that's a lot of spots, Glenn. Yeah, it is. I do have different techniques or ideas or plans for each market. Every market, just like if you're going to say, investing is bad in Ontario, I don't believe that at all. I just think that certain strategies work better in certain markets. Certain markets are great flip markets. Certain markets are good appreciation markets. Some markets are great cash flow markets. And sometimes in the same markets, those two or three strategies, sometimes they're different markets. And markets do run on totally different cycles. What I wanted this episode to be was a redo of episode 1 and episode 100, because this is episode 200. So every 100 episodes, I want to kind of do an overview of an entire 100 episodes, which is once a week. So basically 2 years worth of information. And episode 100 is phenomenal, and it's better than episode 1. And hopefully episode 200 will be better. So I want to do a full summary, go over everything for people who want to be investors. And if you want to dive deeper, I dive much deeper if you're interested in my coaching program, glensutherland.com/coaching. It is probably being an ad stuck somewhere in this during the show. Anyway, and what I wanted to do was flip over episode 100. So instead of finishing with some deals, I'm going to start with some deals, because I think deals is what gets everyone excited. Okay, so I'm going to start off with one of our deals, and I think it might illustrate, like, some people are like, why the heck do you buy in the U.S.? What kind of numbers? What kind of things are you doing? So I'm just going to start off with an example, and then we'll get into the meat and potatoes of this episode. So let's pop something up on the screen right now. So this one is a duplex that I bought during COVID anyway, probably a year or year and a half ago, something like that anyway. So I have in here the purchase price at $17,000. That 17 isn't a true 17, just to be full disclosure. It was about $8,000, I believe, of back taxes and $9,000 of actual purchase price. So it worked out to about $17,000 to get this thing all caught up, because we had to do that on closing in order to take possession. So I just counted as $17,000 cash. Typically I do work in cash on my projects, and then I do refinances into American lending. Asset-based lending is where I usually go for my projects. So in this one, $17,000 purchase, a $60,000 renovation. Quick math, that works out to about $77,000 that you're needed. Just to give you an idea of the project, we had an after repair value on this project. So our all-in cash, $77,000. These numbers are basically the HGTV numbers, where when I mean that is they're missing like some smaller costs, like the carrying costs, like the utilities and stuff of the $50 a month for hydro and $50 a month for gas, and those kind of numbers are all missing from this. It's just super basic numbers. But we had an ARV of $125,000, all in cash of $77,000. So financing, we're going to talk about this week, but financing does change all the time for Canadians or foreign national program. And when we did this refinance, we did refinance at 65% loan to value, meaning we had to put a deposit down of $35,000, but we were working on cash, so that just comes out of the property, if that makes sense to you, which I think it will. So to perfect burr these things, basically, super simple thing, you need to come up with $77,000. An ARV of $125,000, putting a loan on at 65% leverage, that's still going to more than perfect burr. That's going to give us an $81,250. We're not counting in the mortgage setup fees, just for simplicity. But basically, if you wanted to look at this deal quick, it's a duplex. It's a 2-bedroom, 1 bath on each side. If you're listening to this, it looks like a semi-detached, and it's an infinite burr. We refinanced it. We got more than what we put into it, and like when I showed this property a few years back or a year back to some people in London, as they were wording it, like the bricks are worth as much as the purchase price, and these properties do exist. They are out there. You are able to find these. So anyway, I just wanted to put a deal in to get excited, and I mean, maybe people going, what's the rent? What's the rent? Because I just thought I never listed that. So rent is $850 a month times 2 units, right? So they cash flow pretty good. So these are the kind of things you can buy in the States. You don't need the same sort of cash call or cash amounts to do this. And a lot of the projects we're doing are the amount where we required in order to get the whole thing set up could be as little as what you're paying for a down payment to buy a property in Ontario. So the amount of money that we're coming up with in order to close these properties is phenomenally less. So it is much more affordable for lots of people to do this. When I started investing in the US, I did it by myself and had to go through the growing pains of doing that. GlenSutherland.com/coaching. A 12-week coaching program done 1 hour per week over Zoom from the comfort of your own home. Classes are kept to 5 people to be able to answer everyone's questions. Shortcut the process. Make fewer mistakes. Curriculum available at GlenSutherland.com/coaching. Big questions. Can I get lending as a Canadian? Yes, you can. There is lots of different options for getting lending as a Canadian. The one option is you can go to the Canadian banks. Whether you know this or not, a lot of Canadian banks are operating in the United States. To do some name drops, TD is down there. They loan up the East Coast only, so they will not help you nationwide, but they will help you in certain states. TD, Royal, BMO, National Bank, HSBC, and a bunch of smaller little credit unions are also in Canada and the US. So there are options there. The downside to using these banks is you will be personally qualifying for these loans. Typically, they will only let you have 5 properties, and that includes Canada and the US. So for me, being a Canadian investor that's moved to being an American investor, from day one, I couldn't qualify for loans from those banks because I already went over the threshold of 5 before I started, based on my Canadian assets, because they do count your Canadian assets, and that is one of the perks to working with the Canadian banks, is that they are in both countries. They will count all of your stuff in Canada and the US to help you qualify, but it also works against you. So where do you go from there? So there's all the hard money lenders, and in all honesty, even comparing hard money lenders compared to mortgage brokers that broker the hard money lenders, I still typically go to a broker. I like the idea that they're shopping around to pick the best mortgage rate and the best terms, the best leverage rate that I can personally qualify for at this point. I have went direct to the lenders as well, and I found it's basically the same price. They still charge you points. They still charge you They still charge you points, and they charge you the loan origination fees, just like the brokers would. So it's kind of like using a realtor. If you're going to buy a property off the MLS, why wouldn't you use a realtor? Because it doesn't cost you nothing, right? So same sort of thing with brokering loans. If it doesn't cost me anything, then I might as well use it, right? So yeah, that's some of the financing that exists. What kind of leverage? Like I just mentioned, 65%. Certain times of the year, all the fall, we were getting 75% loan to value on cash out refis. It's typically, as you want to put a base point in your calculations, you could probably get 65% any time of the year. Sometimes, basically right now, but this isn't going to air for another month or so after recording this. But right now, at least right now in early February, the leverage rate is around 70%. Most lenders can do 70% for a Canadian investing in the U.S. Yes, if you have a social security number, you could get those leverage rates boosted up. You could go get an E2 visa to get your social security number. You might have a working visa or some other ways to do that. I'm not going to go down that path of getting a social security number, but you can. You still can get that as a Canadian. Will I get taxed in both countries? Yes, you will. So typically, I buy my properties in entities. So yeah, it will flow down based on to a personal tax return in the U.S. So in some cases, you may not do any dividends. You may not have a personal return in the U.S. But in general, you will, if you use an LP or an LLC, it would all flow down and you have personal return in the U.S. Your accountant in the U.S. will give you a piece of paper, which is a summary of what you've paid in the United States. You give that to your Canadian CPA, or you can enter it yourself, just like if you do your own taxes, just like a T4 where you're just copying numbers. It'll be a similar form to that where you can move your numbers from your U.S. taxes onto your Canadian taxes. If you paid any tax in the United States, they will give you that as a credit on your Canadian tax return because there is a tax treaty between both countries. Yeah. Next question. Next big question. How can you buy something you haven't seen, you haven't walked through? Glenn, if you ask me, like, when was the last time you were down in the United States? And it was prior to COVID. I haven't been down there during COVID. Mind you, I'm going down there on Thursday, so I'm going down there in a couple days. But not for business reasons. I'm going down for a personal trip. So, how are you buying these properties, Glenn, without going to see them? And the thing is, you don't need to see the properties. Someone needs to see these properties. I don't buy these things like sight unseen. I have a really hard time buying from the auctions because they are sight unseen. But you run your own numbers, you have someone check all your numbers. And one of those big numbers would be the renovation budget. So if you're going to do a renovation, you'd want a contractor to walk that property or multiple contractors to walk that property. You know, if you're just buying it, you might get a home inspector to go see the property for you. But either way, someone is going to see this property and someone is going to give you a report. And just like if you're taking my coaching program, you need someone to check all of your numbers. There is so many online apps that will tell you how to do everything. You cannot trust these things. You need to have your rent verified by your property manager. You need to have your renovations verified by a contractor. If you're doing a flip, you need your ARV verified by a realtor because you need to know that it's going to sell for what you want to sell it for. You need to know that the property manager can rent it for what you want to rent it for, and you need to know that the contractor can renovate it for what you think it costs. So you need all of these things verified. You can do all the thing and buy all the apps you want, but these things need to be checked. Why buy out of state? Why not just buy in Canada? Well, first of all, property taxes, or taxes in general, they're done differently. The U.S., if you're just going to talk about actually income taxes, they have a shorter depreciation schedule, meaning you can write off stuff faster. You can write off your principal and your interest on your mortgages. And for property taxes, I like to use the analogy of comparing like Kitchener-Waterloo to Toronto, but certain places, even Toronto, for instance, their assessed value is very low, and they can only move it up so fast every year. And there's lots of people that live in Toronto in $1 million or $2 million houses that are assessed for like $300,000. So the same thing can happen in the U.S. So it's not as easy as just going, what's the rate that everyone's being taxed on for property taxes to figure out where you want to invest. Sometimes it's just trying to compare apples to oranges. And what you usually do is try to find a like property in a similar neighborhood in all different markets to try and see what they're at. When you want to compare the property taxes of these properties, if that's an important number to you. For instance, Alabama, my 4-bedroom, 2-bath place was $560 a year for property taxes, which is absurdly low. If you want to go into that same property in Ohio or Indiana, it would probably be like $1,200 to $1,500 for the same property taxes. Doesn't mean that Ohio or Indiana are bad places to go. It's just more expensive. But if we're going to talk about costs, low cost entry. I did that example off the start of buying houses for $9,000, $8,000. You can buy properties really, really cheap. You can buy properties that are very expensive still. You can go into Florida and still buy a $500,000 or $1 million or $10 million house, right? So it's all about figuring what you want and where you want to go. And I always say, like, people who are leaving Ontario, and they go, why are you leaving Ontario? To try and figure out your market. If I'm leaving Ontario because I don't like the landlord-tenant board, then maybe pick a state that has a good eviction laws, right? So figure out what's important to you and pick something that makes sense for you. Some things that always blow my mind is people like, I hate the landlord-tenant board of Ontario, but then I go and invest in, maybe I won't name drop to slander any states, but they go invest in certain states that aren't landlord friendly. They're more tenant friendly again. And I'm like, why? If that was your biggest thing, pick what works for you. Pick the market that works for you, and pick landlord laws that work for yourself, so that evictions will be smooth. Anytime you need to do contracts, and understand that there are contract states. So a contract state means that you, for lease agreements, you're signing a lease for 1 year, and in that time you're locked in for that year, and they're locked in for that year. So if they leave during that, depending on the state, during that period, they could owe you the rest of the rent for that period, because they are renting that place for a whole year. And if you don't have a clause for getting out early and out of the lease, how it works, they do owe you for that rest of the thing. But at the same time, you can't raise your rent at those times. But those states, typically at the end of your rental agreement, your 1 year's expired or your 2 years expired, you can raise the rent whatever you want. You just have to give them proper notice. Sometimes it's 60 days or 90 days to go into whatever, and then they have that time to accept it or not accept it and move out. So it's a little bit different than the way we are now. But that's just the contract states. There could be there's certain states like Missouri where you can raise the rent at any time throughout the whole thing, and then you just have to give notice. All right, so let's change gears a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about the downsides of the U.S. because everybody wants to pitch like this stuff is amazing, everything always works, but there is some downsides to this whole thing, right? First of all, your financing is going to be more difficult. It is much more difficult to do financing in the States. The rates are more expensive. The leverage rates are lower, meaning your down payment's typically higher. I think I mentioned this like at the start of the show, but I do typically work in cash now, and then I refinance into financing. But what is available to Canadians? We can get fix and flip loans. You can still get 90% leverage. They call them 90-100 loans. So you're coming up with 10% of the purchase price and 100% of the renovations being covered. There's some more details to that whole loan process, but there's some super simple numbers for you. Financing is more expensive than Canada. You're not getting those 1.5% rates, but mind you, you got to compare apples to apples. At the same time, you wouldn't be personally, you're talking about a personally qualified loan to a loan that's to a corporation. So you got to more compare American lending to corporate lending, like doing those kind of loans. But it is going to be more expensive in the US than Canada. So be prepared for that. That's going to be the big sticker shock, is the interest rates are higher. But depending on where you're buying, the purchase prices are much lower. So you think about it, and even a higher interest rate, it doesn't matter, because you're talking about such a small amount that you're getting a loan on, right? The IRS, yeah, you're going to be dealing with taxes in the U.S. and taxes in Canada. You are going to be dealing with double tax, but not double tax, because there's a tax treaty. You're not going to pay tax twice on the same project. You just might be paying part of it in Canada and part of it in the U.S. And we kind of touched on that the amortization schedules are much shorter in the U.S., meaning you can write off stuff a lot faster. Cash is king everywhere, but it's even more cash is king in the U.S. And the reason is in Canada, the properties are more expensive. So wholesalers and banks and everyone is on the page. They're all on the same page, knowing that the likelihood is that they are going to be closing and financing, because not enough people can afford to buy these in cash, right? So in the States, they are cheaper properties. You're going to be competing with people who are for these properties who are cash buyers as well. So if you can be a cash buyer, it is a huge advantage. One thing I should note is when you're buying from wholesalers, a lot of the listings will say cash only. You can work with hard money, but what they're really saying is they want fast closes. But if you can work in cash, your offers are more competitive than uncash ones, and you're definitely compared to like a VA loan or an FHA loan, you are way ahead by using cash, which we would not be qualifying for a VA loan or an FHA loan as a Canadian anyway. But that's where it comes down to, is its timelines is what's important to the wholesalers, right? Picking your markets in the United States, there are so many markets, and like I alluded to earlier as well, it's all about finding what's important to you. What is it that is important to you? Because a lot of people are going into expensive markets in Florida. I keep hearing this over and over again. And yes, they cash flow better than Ontario, but they don't cash flow as well as the Midwest, for instance. Maybe there's a personal aspect that you're looking at for the properties. And yes, if you're going to have a personal aspect to these properties, I would want it somewhere warm, right? So I'd want one of the southern states, right, where it's hot. Whereas, in all honesty, if you're going to try to make the highest cash flow, it's going to be the Midwest, is where you're going to, basically the middle of the United States is where you're going to find more, the better cash flowing properties. And it all comes down to rent to value ratios. And what that means is, you've heard the term of the 1% rule. What the 1% rule means is a property that's worth $100,000 would rent for $1,000 a month, right? That'd be the 1% rule. And as you go lower in price, you tend to go into lower grade neighborhoods too. So it'll be higher crime. But as you go lower than than $100,000, for a purchase price, typically the value, the rent to value ratio will go up. So for instance, if you bought a $30,000 house, it wouldn't be out of the ordinary or even seem crazy to get something that rented for $700 or $800 a month, which would be operating up at the 2% or the 2.5%. And you can multiply these things by working in duplexes or fourplexes. You can now, by buying a $20,000 duplex, renovating for $20,000, because we actually did this, and be in it for about $40,000, and then rent each side for $750. And so then your numbers will escalate even higher by doing that, right? So some other things to consider when you're looking at picking your market. You might want to look at vacancy rates. Landlord laws is definitely one of those things that is going to be very important to a lot of people if you're in certain states like BC or Ontario. It might be one of the reasons you're going to the States. Property taxes. Like I said, certain states are much lower than others. Pick a market that cash flows. I think that's the number one rule of real estate, is have a property that cash flows. Believe it or not, there are people who do speculate. People buy a lot of properties with the hopes that they're just going to appreciate. When I run my numbers, appreciation is not on the sheet at all. And if you ever look at any of my deals, you'll see that it's not there anywhere to be found. I don't even allude to what the appreciation rate is, even in the paperwork to go with it. It is a bonus. And even if I am in a market like Florida that's appreciating very well, I don't list it. It's a bonus when we go to do a flip there, because that's what I do in Florida, is I do flips. And it's all planned in. Or it's not planned in. It's a bonus. So we have our ARV is calculated on what it is right now, and if the market appreciates, then it's a bonus. It is not factored into the numbers. Check these cities to see if they coincide with the 20% rule, which means that one employer doesn't hold 20% of the employees of that population for that town. And you go, why does that even matter? Well, it doesn't usually play in most cities. Where it plays in is these smaller towns. in both Canada and the U.S. Meaning, you go into these like little one-horse mining towns, and there's nothing else there. If those mines close, you are in a lot of trouble, right? Because no one wants to live there at all. And where does this happen? Does this happen in Canada? Yes, it does. It happens in northern New Brunswick. There's a lot of those towns that have closed down because the mining closed down. Does it happen in northern Ontario? Yes, it does. Does it happen all over the U.S.? Yes, it does. So just be aware of it. Don't be buying in a one-horse town for the employers, for that place. And I am always looking for population growth in the cities. But it doesn't mean you can't buy in these cities if the population growth is declining. For instance, Detroit, Michigan is a very good market. Lots of people do really well in Detroit, Michigan, but it is a declining population city. So it's very landlord friendly, but it doesn't meet all the criteria. So does that mean that you have to hit the perfect criteria for all of these things? No, it doesn't mean that. You just pick what's important to you, right? And a lot of times when I'm micro-managing markets, right? So once I've figured out, I'm going all in on Indianapolis or somewhere, right? I want to look at the school zones and the crime rates for those for the areas I'm in and for the neighborhoods. And does a bad crime rate mean don't buy there? No, it just means that I better get getting paid for it because you're going to probably have more vacancy. So make sure if you're buying in those rougher neighborhoods that you're going to get paid really well for it, just because it will happen. You will have more vacancy and more turnover and more expenses. So just be prepared for it. Where do you find your deals? Same thing, Canada, the US. No big surprises here. Number one place is off the MLS. That's where most people find their deals. And to do that, you call a realtor. I find about 5%, I say, of my deals off the MLS. And I don't scour the MLS myself. I will have, sometimes a realtor will bring me a pocket listing or something like that. Or if I'm going off the MLS, it might be a short sale or foreclosures, because I will look through the MLS to find those specifically, which are listed properties. Pocket listings I love as well. That's where the realtor has it under contract, but they haven't listed it on the MLS, so they'll show it to some of their other clients before they do so. And really, the value in at least I find in real estate is the fewer eyes that see it, the more likelihood it's a good deal, or because it hasn't been taken yet. So it's just to get there first. And so by getting it before the MLS, it's an advantage. By buying it from a wholesaler, it could be an advantage. Wholesalers can sell stuff at market value or above market value. They are just people that have a contract to assign. So do your due diligence on those and check all of their numbers. All the numbers that they give you are good and fine, but have someone verify them, or verify them even. Well, I'd verify them myself first and then have someone else triple verify them to make sure that or double verify, make sure that they are actually accurate. I talked briefly tax short sales, foreclosures. You can get those from the bank. You can buy tax deeds. You can buy tax liens, and you can buy for sale by owners. And I'm sure there's probably lots of other ways, but that was what my list was. So building your team out, you're going to need a whole bunch of people: property managers, contractors, wholesalers, attorneys. You don't necessarily have to come up with all of this at day one. A lot of these things you can get from word of mouth. If you browse around Bigger Pockets, Facebook, talk to people that are already doing it there. There's a lot of ways to build this out, but property managers are probably the easiest part of the puzzle to find. So when you're looking for property management, you might be getting them from your turnkey provider and you're kind of just stuck with them. It could work out well in your favor. I've had about my early days when I bought turnkey. I bought 4 turnkeys and I had one maybe work out overall. I've fired all of them since then. But I guess the one in Missouri I still have. But for finding your contractors, I'll give you some don'ts for doing your contractors. Don't give them a whole pile of money to start. Start with a small deposit and then continue giving them more money, or work with a a lending program so that the lending program is dictating how they're paid. Don't find your contractors by Googling contractor or searching Craigslist. It hasn't every part. I've get lots of phone calls from people who listen to the show, and it's usually those are the number one problems that people have had. And that's my first question I always ask is, how did you find these people? And finding them off of those sources is just not good. Not a good place to find your contractors. Turnkey, I will talk about this just because there is better ways to buy your property. Like, why do people buy Turnkey? It's easy. It's the time. It doesn't take much time. You're far away from these properties, so it's just you want something just done for you, right? You don't have a team. They might be able to connect you with lawyers and CPAs and get your stuff all sort of built out. A lot of times it comes with the tenants already in place, so they've vetted the tenants prior to you. They pay all the tenant setup fees, and they typically have better knowledge of the area than you do. The problem with Turnkey is, if you know real estate, your money is made when you buy the property and when you renovate and create value in the property. And you've given up two of the biggest parts of real estate to somebody else. A turnkey operator is typically someone similar to me, where you buy the property and renovate the property, but instead of selling it out to the MLS, where you're going to have to deal with FHA financing and all these crazy American financing programs that are going to be very difficult and may require additional renovations to your renovated property. Believe me, they get to sell it to an investor and skip all of that stuff. And I always hear about people saying, I bought this turnkey property and I bought it at such a discount. And I always think of myself more on the turnkey operator side because I do the renovations. And I go, why would the turnkey operator sell it to you for so cheap? It doesn't make sense. And I'm like, did you get the property appraised? No. Did you pull comps? No. So you're just taking someone else's word for it that you got a big deal. Yes. Do your own homework. And if the very least, call a realtor or someone to look these things up for you. The market is appreciating. It will bubble out some of your mistakes that you make, but try to make less mistakes. Do your own homework ahead of time. The one problem I had when I first started is I did use some of these property managers to build out, do some of my renovation work, because property managers do have people to do tenant turnovers, so they can maybe do some light renovation for you. And it was an easy step into it when I started. But when you use turnkey operators, a lot of those turnkey operators, or they could, the handyman could be on the turnkey operator's staff, like W-2 employees, which is like similar to a T4 employee, and they will never be your employee, or they'll never be able to even work for you. So it's something to keep in mind if that's your intention of doing turnkey, to leverage that team in order to continue building. It may not work out the way you're expecting it to. In all honesty, if I was going to do it myself, I would JV or work with someone who's already doing that, to try and skip all the steps off the start of doing the turnkey and buying at close to retail prices. You would be better off to buy at discounted prices and get half of the deal. Anyway, personal opinion. And if you buy these turnkey properties, they do typically are much more difficult to burr because they are too close to retail prices, right? Do it yourself. That's what I do, is do it myself. If you take my coaching program, glensutherland.com/coaching, that's what we do teach, is to do it yourself, set up your own teams. We kind of sugar-coated over it on this episode about how we do it. But anyway, do it yourself, set up your own teams. Some disadvantages is, like, some of the turnkey operators will be paying for the lease-up fee for the first tenant. Sometimes it's a month's rent or half a month's rent. So you give that up, right? You got to manage this renovation from a distance, so it could mean setting up a project manager on top of your contractor to keep this thing going. Anyway, and you're going to have vacancy during the renovation. So what does that mean? You're not going to have a tenant in there while you're doing the renovation. So compared to turnkey, sometimes you buy the property and you get cash flow right from day one. Typically, if you're doing the renovation yourself, you're going to have the vacancy. There's going to be money going out, but no money coming in. But you should be buying it right so that it more than pays for that amount of money during the thing. So building your team. So go over this quickly. Who you need: a lender, property manager, construction crew, an accountant, title agent, attorney. Attorneys do work at title agencies, so sometimes they can be leveraged back and forth. But there's a lot of pieces to have built up for your team. So the big advantages to doing yourself is creativeness. You have your mind, which is so powerful, and you have the ability to leverage all of these things you've learned from podcasts and coaching courses and trainings and everything else and put it together. So, for instance, you could do a BRRRR on these projects, flips, lease options, all kinds of seller financing. You can get as creative as you want, right? And by buying with with turnkey operators, you just may not get all those options, right? Remember, money's made during the renovations. Money's made when you buy, right? And you can purchase at better prices, right? By using wholesalers, even if you're buying off the MLS, using short sales, foreclosures, tax deeds, and other off-market ways of doing things through Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace and everything else. Okay, so if we're going to talk, I'll talk briefly anyway about seller financing. Is it available? Can Canadians get this? It is very available. A lot of these properties we're buying at much lower price points, and even still, some of these owners have owned them for many years. They're often paid off. There's so many properties that are paid off that are sitting in cash. It is very available to get seller financing. Is your wholesaler going to bring you seller finance deals? Typically not often. Most wholesalers aren't trained on trying to negotiate seller financing. They try to negotiate on the price only. And as you know, you can negotiate on the price or the terms, and typically they don't negotiate on the terms. If you're doing your own lead gen and talking to people, it is a great way to get into the market, into the U.S. by using seller financing. It could solve some of your financing issues. For instance, you want to buy a mobile home park. They are hard to get financing for. You want properties that are zoned funny, like manufactured home. It's still it's not a trailer. It's on a foundation, but those ones are much difficult to finance. Some multifamily, if it has too much vacancy, it's too hard. It's hard to finance. A lot of people will say no to it, right? Zoning issues, mixed-use buildings. I have a mixed-use building right now. Very difficult to finance. Still doable. We still did it, but it is much more difficult to finance those things, right? And it could solve some problems if you have property line issues or too close to the house, because sometimes lenders won't lend on things because they don't meet their guidelines. So seller financing or a VTB could get around all this stuff, right? Like I said, you negotiate on either the price or the terms or both. But if you get into the terms thing, there is much more flexibility and things you can come up with, right? So terms, some things you can negotiate on would be maybe you want to make your thing interest only, or a mortgage payment deferral so you don't have to pay for the first 6 months or 3 months or something like that. A subject to loan, a principal only loan, interest only, I already said that one, and a short-term loan during the reno, right? Because sometimes if you pitch seller financing to someone, they're like, I don't want my money in 10 years. And you go, well, what about in 6 months? What if we negotiated a seller finance deal for 6 months? And they go, well, what's the point? And you're like, well, get this. I'm going to buy this property off of you. I'm then going to renovate it. It's going to be worth way more money. If I actually miss any of my payments or anything, you could take this back. It's going to be much more beautiful when I'm done with it. And this could be a huge value to you. And guess what? Now, if I didn't have to go set up a fix and flip loan, I get to skip paying points and origination fee. And even if I'm doing it with a private lender, I can skip some possibly the high interest rates, right? So there's a lot of advantages by negotiating seller financing, even for a short term. And you could flip this on its side even and do it as a lease option where you are the one leasing the property instead of leasing it out to somebody else, which would give you basically a rental contract. You'd be renting the property. You'd have to get permission to renovate during your rental, and then have an option contract to purchase the property. So now you could renovate the property with just paying rent, and then refi out or buy it based on whatever. Maybe you could find, I have a lender if you are interested, but you could find a lender that will refi at day one. So you have a guaranteed purchase price of this, but it's actually worth twice as much. Then maybe you could put your loan on based on the ARV and not actually on the purchase price, and refi on day one and actually get cash back to buy the property. How cool would that be? Anyway, there's so much. We take the course. We talk about this for quite a while. There's so many different options you can do if you can get seller financing running on your side of this whole thing. Financing cheap properties. Up until, I don't know, probably a year ago, I thought it was impossible to finance cheap properties. It is possible to finance cheap properties. I have a lender that'll finance a $5,000 property. Probably doesn't make any sense to do so, but they would. They have no minimums, right? And typically, these cheap properties, they do require cash for closing. A lot of times, like I said, the wholesalers will insist on it, so you're talking cash or hard money. They're not probably going to wait for a regular bank. And in all honesty, they're probably not going to qualify with a regular bank, right? Because there's stuff that isn't perfect with these properties. Let's talk a bit about corporate structure. So, corporate structure. What are the structures in the U.S.? So there's an LP, a limited partnership, LLC, a limited liability company, a C Corp, and an S Corp. Throw S Corp out the window to start, because as a Canadian, you can't do an S Corp. An S Corp has to have every single citizen that's registered on there to be an American. So no S Corps for Canadians. Maybe there might be some sort of loophole that if you had a corporation, American corporation, you might be able to slip it in there. And I don't know. But as a whole, S Corps, stay away from, because of the you have to be American to use them, right? So we're down to LP, LLC, and C Corp. So C Corp is pretty much as similar to a Canadian corp as you can get in the U.S., meaning if you want to pull money out, it's going to be charged, taken as dividends. You're going to pay corporate tax on the properties. Where an LP or an LLC is a flow-through entity, meaning you will pay taxes personally on what you make. So it'll flow through. You're right. You do a corporate tax return, but you'll be paying taxes at your personal rate. So they both have different advantages depending what your goals are. And literally, whenever I have my accountant set these up, we have come up with dozens of different ways to set them up based on what the goals of the corporation are going to be, or entity are going to be. And so sometimes if we're doing flipping, or we're doing BRRRRs, or we're doing lease options, and how many we're doing will dictate which is the best option for whatever strategy, right? And so who sets these up? I have my CPA do it. Yes, you can do some online services to do this. They will be cheaper, I'm sure. I've never used them, but I'm sure they are cheaper. But I like to have someone do it for me. I like to make sure there's no mistakes done. I want a professional and someone who is licensed to make sure it's done properly. But you do you, whatever makes you feel comfortable. And the one thing to think about is double tax when we're starting to talk about corporate structures, right? So the corporate tax rate is lower. So if you're using a C Corp, you're going to be paying lower taxes. But whenever you pull your dividends out, you're going to be taxed on half of the dividend. So you're going to be taxed again. So if you're doing a strategy where you're not pulling money out, it's just reusing it in the same company, C Corp is definitely going to be the way to go, because you're only going to be paying tax at a lower rate. And if you leave it in the corporation, not pulling any dividends, you're going to be way ahead. Whereas LP LLC is going to flow through personal taxes. Where you get a little sticky is LLCs, limited liability companies. The Canada Revenue Agency does not have an equivalent structure to an LLC. They look at an LP and go, yeah, we have an LLP in Canada, so that's kind of the same. They look at a C Corp, it's kind of like our Canadian Corp. So But an LLC, they don't have an equivalent structure. So the way they look at an LLC is they think of it as a C Corp. So the problem, if you use an LLC as your main structure, is Canada Revenue will go, okay, you should be taxed at the corporate tax rate for your LLC. But guess what? That money's flowed down to you personally, and in the States, you're paying personal taxes on your LLC, and in Canada, you're paying corporate taxes. Guess what? Double tax. So you don't want that, right? So you can use LLCs, you just don't want it at the top of your structure. So if you, there's a million ways to set these up. You could put an LP at the top that just owns the properties. It's the simplest way. You could put an LP with a bunch of LLCs underneath it. LLC number one takes all the liability, right? Just like it would be like the general partner. Take 99% of the liability. 1% goes up to the LP, and you put all the properties in LLC 2, 3, 4, 5. I've done that way before. I put stuff just in straight LPs, and in all honesty, that's what I mostly do. And I've also used the C Corp method. Always work. And it's just all about what your intention is. And that's why I want to talk to a professional about it so that it's set up. It's going to make the most sense for what my goals are for the company. Okay, almost done, guys. So what I want to talk about lastly is what happens if there's another crash in the U.S. For some reason, no one believes that there'll ever be one in Canada, but what happens if there's one in the U.S.? So we'll just pretend that that's how it works. So typically, cycles are 10 years. You can take that with a grain of salt because right now in both countries they're running long. Who lost their properties during the 2007, 8, 9 recession, wherever you want to say that's when it happened? Who lost their properties? It's people who didn't have a CapEx fund. It's people who didn't have cash reserves saved up so that when stuff went bad, a roof went, whatever happened, they didn't have the money to fix it. There was nothing for them to do but to give the property up, right? The other people who lost their houses during the recession are people who had short-term financing, meaning they were in the middle of a fix and flip loan. They got to the end and they wanted to BRRRR the property, and at the end of that, there was no financing, because what happens with the U.S. is when something happens, like even COVID, they tighten up. And so leverage rates usually drop, and even programs just disappear. So maybe the foreign national program could just disappear, and you wouldn't have a refi option. So that's you just didn't have the financing to roll into. It just doesn't exist. But there's more options, and there's always they've because of 2007, 8, 9, there is all these hard money lenders that exist now because of this, and they're happy to scoop you up. The interest rates during a time of pressure will go up. I'm not kidding. Who's kidding who? They will go up, but there will be options, right? The last recession has created options for going forward. And the last thing why people lost their houses is their properties didn't cash flow. They're speculators, and this is happening again. People are speculating on these properties in both countries, and I see it all the time in Canada, and everyone believes that this market is going to go up forever. It's a crazy way of thinking. Make sure your properties cash flow. It is the number one rule of real estate investing. Make sure they all cash flow. You can still buy in appreciating markets. If you listen to like Robert Kiyosaki, like how many houses could you buy? And you're like, as many as I can get my hands on. It says in the book, right? Because they cash flow, right? As long as they make more than they cost, then yes. But if you have a whole bunch of properties that cost you money every month, how many of those can you buy? I don't know, but it's not a good place to be in, right? I wouldn't advise that to anyone. And the number one rule also, or another, not number one rule, but another good rule is you haven't lost anything till you sell, right? So if there is a recession starting to go down, if you can hold the property for the 10 years, they say, if you read The Wealthy Barber, it says, if you hold the property for 10 years, you bought the very top of a cycle, at the very least, you'll be at least at where it was in 10 years. So, and did this even hold true in the 2007, 8, 9 recession? Yes, it did. In 10 years, all markets were recovered, and you could sell for what you bought it for. So the rule does hold up. So, thank you for listening to this, everybody. I think it was a little bit different than my one I did 2 years ago for episode 100. You guys know where to find me. Check out the podcast channel. If you're looking for the coaching, glensutherland.com/coaching. If you have questions, glenn@glensutherland.com. If you want a topic covered, email me at glenn@glensutherland.com. I will literally find a guest who is an expert on that topic, or I'll just cover it myself if it's something that a strategy that I do. But bring them in. I will find somebody for you. I want to make sure that this podcast gives the most value. So just ask. Thanks, everyone. I'll see you guys next week.